Hi, everybody. Thank you for joining us. My name is Siobhan Carroll, and I'm from Enterprise Health, and I'll be your host today. For those of you who don't know, Enterprise Health is an award-winning healthcare-focused cybersecurity firm. We're a certified HITRUST assessor with extensive experience in the NIST cybersecurity framework. We provide products and services to assess, remediate, and monitor cybersecurity risk, regulatory compliance programs, organizational resilience, and third-party risk management. Today's webinar will focus on HIPAA Security Risk Assessments, why they are important and what they're comprised of. The webinar itself will take about 30 to 35 minutes, and we'll leave a couple of minutes at the end for Q&A. A couple of quick tips for the webinar. Throughout the webinar, we'll keep all lines muted to prevent the background noises. If you need to get in touch with me, please use the chat feature accessible by clicking the chat button that shows up in the bottom middle of your screen. Send your technical difficulties to me listed as host. And if you have any questions that you'd like the presenters to address, please chat them to me whenever you think of them. Harrison and Ian will answer them at the end. After today's session, you'll receive an email from us. If you're interested in the copy of the slides, please let us know. With that, I will introduce Ian and Harrison. Ian is a senior security consultant at Enterprise Health. He's a healthcare IT security and privacy expert. He's previously worked with the Jefferson Health System. He's a graduate of a National Center of Academic Excellence in Cybersecurity as recognized by the NSA and DHS. Harrison Welsh is another security rock star on our team. Harrison is also an IT risk management, privacy, and security consultant. He has experience in both the public and private sector. He's focused on implementing information security programs involving security, privacy, and insider threat. With that, I will let Harrison and Ian take it away.
Thanks so much, Siobhan. This is Ian Terry speaking. To get us started, I'm going to go over today's agenda. We'll start out by talking about requirements around performing a security risk assessment, specifically those requirements as they relate to regulatory compliance, as well as requirements that might exist in any frameworks an organization would aspire to obtain. Next, we'll talk about the components of an SRA, or what makes up an ideal SRA as far as our concept of what an ideal SRA entails. Finally, we'll talk about Enterprise Health's SRA service offering and how it's been engineered to satisfy all of those concepts and ideal components of an ideal SRA. With that, I'll pass it off to Harrison to get us started talking about the requirements for an SRA.
Thanks, Ian, for providing that overview. Today, we're going to begin by talking about how an SRA is not only a requirement by various organizations and regulations, but performing one is also a necessary good for your organization. So just to provide a little bit of a background, since 2014, we've seen like a steady increase in healthcare data breaches totaling over 2,000. These breaches involve over 500 or more patient records. Combined, these breaches have resulted in the disclosure of hundreds of millions of healthcare records. HIPAA's most recent data breach journal released for May 2020. Now they release data breach journals every month, but this one marked the lowest number of monthly breaches since December 2018, and the first time in 17 months that healthcare data breaches have been reported at a rate of less than 1 per day. Several cybersecurity companies have reported an increase in COVID-19 related breaches as well, from events such as phishing attacks that use COVID-19 themes to entice the user to click on those phishing attempts. While there's strong evidence to suggest that these types of attacks have increased since the start of the pandemic, the number of cyber attacks appears to have broadly remained the same or even just slightly increased. It's speculated that threat attackers may have taken the decision not to attack healthcare providers on the front line in the fight against COVID-19. Also, even though the number of breaches that have fallen from April to May, the number of healthcare records breached were more than twice the number of records breached in April, with healthcare providers being the most common culprit of the breaches. One of the best ways to address this continuous issue and reduce the likelihood of a breach occurring is by being proactive and taking the time to perform a comprehensive SRA. This assessment will look at your organization's overall cybersecurity posture to help identify areas of risk. And by performing an SRA, you can help prevent your organization from making it onto HHS's wall of shame, which is really just what this data breach journal is. So now we're going to start looking at the different requirements that are required by HIPAA, HITRUST, and also OCR. So once again, to provide a little bit of context, back in 1996, Congress passed the HIPAA, which is the Health Information Portability and Accountability Act, which this regulation establishes standards for privacy and security of PHI and is the basis of much of the healthcare security industry today. The HIPAA security rule requires that all organizations conduct an accurate and thorough assessment of the potential risks and vulnerabilities to the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of ePHI held by covered entities or business associates. It's pretty challenging to understand really what this requirement states, and it comes off as pretty vague. And it doesn't really tell you what needs to be tested, when, or how often. And it definitely doesn't provide you instructions on how to go about performing an assessment. So that's where the Office of Civil Rights, or HHS OCR, comes in. The U.S. Department of Health and Human Services Office for Civil Rights, or OCR, enforces the HIPAA privacy, security, and breach notification rules. It issues a series of guidances which assist organizations in identifying, implementing the most effective and appropriate administrative, physical, and technical safeguards to ensure electronic PHI is safeguarded. So ACR has provided guidance on several elements of the risk analysis process. These elements must be included in that risk analysis, including things like determining the scope of the analysis, data collection, identifying and documenting potential threats and vulnerabilities, assessing current security measures, determining the likelihood, impact, and level of risk, finalizing the risk analysis documentation, and then periodically going back and reviewing and updating the risk assessment. Now, OCR's guidance is not necessarily intended to be a one-size-fits-all blueprint for compliance, but it can be helpful in determining the direction of your organization's overall risk analysis process. So a little fun fact, as a response to COVID-19, OCR provided a whole bunch of different bulletins, notifications, and a whole bunch of different guidance that can help understand how patient health information may be used and disclosed during the pandemic. So also the Office of Inspector General recently came up with healthcare compliance program tips, or rather what they call the 7 fundamental elements of an effective compliance program. On this slide, we've listed those 7 fundamental elements, but today I just really want to talk about the importance of 2 of these tips. The first being implementing written policies, procedures, and standards of conduct. Now, by doing this, your organization will implement strong administrative safeguards, which is one of the key activities involved in performing a security risk assessment. The second tip I want to call out is number 5 on this slide, conducting internal monitoring and auditing. Now, by following this tip, your organization will strengthen your vulnerability management and event monitoring safeguards, which also plays a large role in the technical portion of an SRA. Now, by considering the 7 tips provided in this slide, your organization can take a proactive step in strengthening the overall cybersecurity program and compliance program.
So Harrison just covered the regulatory compliance requirements as they relate to security assessment, but I want to talk briefly about HITRUST requirements. The HITRUST CSF, as you know, is a third-party framework that is engineered towards the unique challenges and needs of healthcare organizations, either covered entities or business associates, providing them with a comprehensive, flexible, and efficient approach to regulatory compliance and risk management. And like the HIPAA and OCR requirements imposed on healthcare organizations, the HITRUST CSF also has specific requirements as they relate to security risk assessment. If you're familiar with the HITRUST CSF, you'll know it's divided up into 19 domains. I've listed here 4 domains which are directly impacted by security risk assessment and include specific verbiage on how they should be conducted. A key takeaway being that the HITRUST CSF standardizes those requirements between different regulatory bodies and standards to provide that clarity and consistency, and that extends onto your security risk assessment practice if you're currently holding or aspiring to obtain a HITRUST certification. Now, being that our organization and myself and Harrison do a lot of work with companies that are currently holding a HITRUST certification or working towards obtaining that, we often are faced with the question shown there, does my HITRUST certification act as an SRA? And we can really extend that concept to include, do any of my other security certifications, does my work towards HITRUST certification, my SOC audit reports and activities, do all of those count as an SRA? Really, during all of those activities performed in pursuit of compliance with those frameworks or those certifications, there is a lot of gap analysis work, gap evaluation exercises. And generally, from what we see, those activities don't tend to act as security risk assessments. And the reasons being is highlighted there in blue. Security risk assessments must identify existing vulnerabilities, identify those potential threats, which oftentimes fall into the scope of those gap evaluation exercises. However, that last key point, utilizing parameters to evaluate risk, the primary importance of that risk assessment activity that separates it from a gap evaluation exercise is once your security assessors have come to understand the vulnerabilities and threats, associating that tailored risk level and risk interpretation to those findings is what makes that an SRA. On the other hand, you can engineer your SRA activities and conduct them in such a way as to support your framework compliance efforts. Again, making sure your SRA, for example, is being performed in accordance with the expectations of your HITRUST certification or HITRUST requirements, or even NIST CSF requirements or other frameworks. Now, with that, we'll move into the next section and talk about the general components of an SRA, as well as some of our interpretations of best practices and what we believe is the ideal approach to an SRA. Now, from a general standpoint, a security risk assessment is an exercise conducted by the organization, often in cooperation with an objective third-party assessor that seeks to assess and evaluate that organization's overall security posture and their environment, specifically as it relates to the protection of HIPAA information, PHI. So I have here 6 components of your organization's security posture that would fall into scope for an SRA. An SRA will evaluate the policies and procedures that make up your security program, or more specifically, the documentation that contains those policies and procedures. It would assess your physical, technical, and administrative controls. And all 5 of those things are ultimately evaluated for compliance with the regulatory requirements that apply, HIPAA and OCR, or in some circumstances, whatever framework requirements also apply, if applicable. Ultimately, that comprehensive examination across those 6 components serves to produce data, actionable and meaningful data that informs you and your security teams as to the state of your security program.
So every organization that holds PHI or ePHI should root out areas where there's risk. Performing an SRA is really all about protecting patient information, patient safety, and ensuring that patients have the best care available. So performing an SRA helps to provide insight and help all members throughout your organization better understand your organization's risks to business operations. Establishing a formal risk assessment program will then also provide an efficient means for communicating assessment findings and recommending actions to business unit managers. Performing an SRA also helps to establish a starting point for organizations to know where to focus their attention and understand what is needed to advance protection of sensitive information. Lastly, performing an SRA will help to create a security roadmap to help prioritize and continuously address your organization's security risks. Conducting periodic SRAs will help to ensure that your organization is compliant with HIPAA administrative, physical, and technical controls.
So combining all those concepts, we have here the ideal SRA checklist that we present to you now. We know that as a healthcare organization, we're required to perform a security risk assessment in order to meet those regulatory requirements published under HIPAA and by OCR. Also, if our organization currently possesses or aspires to obtaining a HITRUST certification, a different security certification, or is utilizing a specific framework such as NIST CSF around which to build our security program, we want to ensure that our SRA activities are meeting those requirements as well. We know our SRA needs to identify threats, vulnerabilities, and risks and use ratings of those against which to inform priority. All of those representing that informative and actionable data, which we'll utilize in our security teams and across our company to ensure that we are effectively and efficiently managing our security posture and our security environment. So ultimately, we want to be compliant with HIPAA and OCR. For some, we want our framework requirements to be satisfied with our SRA activity. And smart companies should be aware of all of the spectrum of what can be beneficial for them as it relates to SRA activities, so that they can be conducted in such a way as to holistically serve their security and privacy needs. So moving into the next section, we've established a high-level understanding of our obligation to SRA and how to best describe the ideal SRA. And now I want to talk more specifically about enterprise health and best practices and how our SRA service offering really stands to satisfy all of those points. Our SRA service offering is a comprehensive and compliance-focused review, and it involves 3 key activities. The first one, administrative review. Second, physical walkthrough, and finally, a technical assessment component. And Harrison and I will delve into each of these components moving forward.
So thanks, Ian. As Ian just stated, the first activity as part of our SRA service offering is we go and we perform an in-depth review of your organization's administrative policies and procedures. So specifically, our team reviews documents or documentation regarding the topics of information security, things like business continuity, disaster recovery, things like vulnerability management and incident response, and so on. The scope is pretty wide. It's up to your organization to define what kind of policies and procedures you want us to look into. So the goal of our analysis is really to identify deficiencies within your organization's policies and procedures. So we take these deficiencies, we catalog them, we rate them, and they're then utilized to determine your organization's adherence to in-scope regulations such as HIPAA, NIST CSF, HITRUST, PCI DSS, the list goes on and on. It's really up to the scope of your organization. Enterprise Health has a lot of experience with different information security requirements across various regulatory bodies. So using our experience and our expertise, our information security consultants can then provide remediation suggestions to address documentation and procedural gaps.
The second activity as part of our SRA service is the physical walkthrough. A physical walkthrough is where our assessors will actually go to your facilities and your locations that are in scope, be those clinical areas, administrative facilities, offices, even data centers could potentially be in scope for your SRA. And our assessors will evaluate the physical controls in place at those locations, such as physical access controls, ultimately searching and working to determine how PHI is being handled and secured at those locations. And that could involve anything from printer and monitor placement all the way to the utilization of shred bins and confirming how your clean desk policy is being enforced in that cross-sectional physical walkthrough a day. So also, it's a really valuable time to confirm via physical inspection whether or not or how effectively all of the technical configurations, patch management, antivirus software is being promulgated throughout your technical environment. So we'll go and take a device, or we'll take a workstation and just work to confirm that all of the technical configurations that you expect to be in place are adequately implemented there. Of course, in the current COVID-19 circumstance, we recognize there are challenges to being physically on site to conduct this portion of the SRA. Of course, we're able to compensate for that. However, your organization needs or feels most comfortable compensating, we'll utilize video conference calls using technologies with which we're all probably pretty familiar at this point, such as Zoom or Microsoft Teams or even FaceTime, in order to facilitate a virtual guided walkthrough. And we've already accomplished many successful instances using this compensating approach.
So the third activity performed as part of our SRA service offering is performing a thorough technical assessment to evaluate your organization's technical controls. So our team does this by performing both internal and external vulnerability scans, either on site or via a virtual machine established by our organization. With COVID-19 pandemic going on, it's pretty popular nowadays that we would set up a virtual machine within your environment and then configure the scan to run instead of actually us being there in person, but that's still an option just in case. Internal network scans are then performed on a subnet range of IP addresses established ahead of time by your organization. Now, by establishing a wide subnet range, the vulnerability scanning tool that we use will evaluate a large scope without being intrusive and with little to no impact on your business operations. We will then also perform an external internet-facing vulnerability scan on an internet-facing host or website identified by the organization. And the goal of this scan is really to identify vulnerabilities which, if exploited, could allow attackers to access sensitive information within that host. Now, we utilize Tenable Nessus, which is an industry-leading vulnerability scan, to perform both of those internal and external vulnerability scans. The benefit of utilizing Nessus is that it identifies and prioritizes current potential risks to devices and determines the realistic potential impact to your environment. To provide an example, the Nessus vulnerability scans usually help to validate if up-to-date supported software are used, or if your organization has implemented encryption certificates, and making sure that those certificates are in place and up to date. Detected vulnerabilities are then analyzed, rated, and consolidated by our team for actionable considerations by IT, networking, and your organization's security personnel.
Thanks, Harrison. Now, while we're on the topic of technical assessment, I want to briefly talk about penetration testing and how that might come into play. Now, penetration testing is not generally a part of a security risk assessment, nor is it a required component of a proper SRA. However, we find that penetration testing is a great way to get a more targeted, more in-depth approach of an assessment of your technical environment, specifically going beyond just that vulnerability scan Harrison just described, and actually attempting to actively circumvent whatever technical controls you have in place, firewall configurations, user access controls, really a focused and targeted attempt to circumvent those and try to relay to you as a result what those weak points in your network are and how far an attacker could get if they were to be carrying out these activities in a real world situation. And of course, these penetration testing activities are obviously able to be performed against network environments, but we can also perform them against applications and even leverage social engineering as a potential methodology, so you can receive a lot of insight and information as to how your security environment would be affected by those types of attacks.
So the final phase of our SRA service offering is to provide your organization with various SRA outputs and deliverables to really make our SRA whole process very tangible. The first deliverable or output that we will provide to your organization is a comprehensive report of findings. This written report of findings is comprised of various different things. An executive summary, first off, which brings together all findings into a comprehensive summary to be utilized and presented to, say, a board of directors or to executive management who may not have the time to sit down and review a long, comprehensive report. The report also includes all operational risk assessment findings, which were determined from our in-depth administrative policy and procedure review, as well as the findings from our physical walkthrough, either virtually or in person. We also provide all technical assessment findings from the completed vulnerability scans and penetration tests if you opt into performing a penetration test. And then also, if provided, we will provide a comparison between your current risk assessment findings and then as well as previous third-party findings. So by comparing your findings on a year-to-year basis, your organization can see how your information security program has been developed and how it is improving over time. So our team of talented information security consultants will also provide recommendations to address identified vulnerabilities, and those recommendations will just be provided throughout the entire report. Lastly, the report of findings can be aligned to NIST, HIPAA, HITRUST, or really any other regulatory requirements as needed, really depending on the scope of your entire assessment.
In addition to the report of findings, you'll also receive an operational risk tracker. The operational risk tracker is an inventory of all the risks and all the vulnerabilities discovered during the first two phases of the security risk assessment activity, those being administrative review and physical walkthrough, respectively. In the operational risk tracker, we'll identify those vulnerabilities and risks using impact and likelihood, specifically the PAIRS risk rating methodology, in order to evaluate the severity of those findings. And this practice ties directly back to the OCR requirements we described around risk analysis. That's what we use to inform our approach and how we've structured this deliverable. In addition to those identifications, we'll provide whatever corresponding HIPAA security rule statements are directly relevant to those exact findings, which will serve as a very valuable reference as you're trying to understand the relevance or the necessity of understanding that finding and understanding why remediation is necessary. And in addition to those HIPAA security rule statements, we could actually include whatever corresponding framework requirements and controls as references as well. Anything from your HITRUST CSF requirements to NIST 853 or NIST CSF controls, even going into PCI DSS as a potential option. And of course, the operational risk tracker includes suggested remediation activities associated with all of those findings. And I want to take a moment to say that these remediation activities are informed by our extended work with your organization, going through those three phases where we really get to understand how your security environment is fleshed out, how it's supported, and importantly, what resources or tools you already have available, so that when we provide those remediation suggestions, we are not just giving you boilerplate suggestions. These are informed and tailored to your organization and can be really executed effectively and efficiently by your security teams. In addition to the operational risk tracker, you'll also receive the technical risk tracker, which, much like the operational risk tracker, includes an inventory of all the vulnerabilities and their associated risks discovered during the last activity, that technical assessment, or more specifically, the technical vulnerability scans that we'll conduct. The technical risk tracker will include all of those findings and their associated risk, this time leveraging the Common Vulnerability Scoring System, or CVSS, which is a industry standard for evaluating the risk of known technical vulnerabilities. The technical risk tracker will break down those vulnerabilities by host name, IP, network, even operating system, all the different data points that will be valuable to your technical teams when receiving this information so that they are empowered to remediate effectively through targeted patching or configuration management. They'll be able to prioritize their remediation of whatever technical vulnerabilities we present to you.
So the final SRA outputs provided by our team is a final presentation, a PowerPoint presentation, and then an optional working session. The final presentation really incorporates high-level details from the reported findings into a short PowerPoint for your organization to use as you wish, or to present to executive leadership, management, and really non-technical audiences, because it won't provide as much detail as the reported findings does. Our team will also provide an optional working session, which can be performed either in person or via conference call. So instead of just simply handing over all of our findings from the completed SRA, our team will actually sit down with your organization and really any necessary personnel to perform an in-depth review of the risks that we identified, including the technical testing results and remediation recommendations for your information security and technical teams. So now I'll pass it back to Ian to wrap up everything we talked about today.
Thanks so much, Harrison. So we've covered the remediation, regulatory and framework compliance related requirements that are imposed on healthcare organizations and how they relate to SRA. And in that regard, we've discussed how important it is to have confidence in compliance with whatever security risk assessment activity you're performing, and whether you're performing it internally with your own security teams or leveraging a trusted, objective third party. You should seek to know that you're satisfying those HIPAA and OCR requirements and structure your SRA accordingly. And also leverage that SRA data, if applicable, to support whatever framework compliance goals that you might have. Next, you should recognize and overcome the challenge in sustainability. We recognize that security is an ongoing activity, and our SRA program seeks to support long-term operations and strategy for healthcare organizations, because security risk assessments not only represent a starting point or checking the box, but they're a great opportunity to create a roadmap and ascertain methods of long-term remediation. And the more SRAs you conduct, they're a great method for determining trends and measuring progress year over year. Finally, we should strive to obtain satisfaction in security. Whatever outputs, whatever data we're obtaining by way of our SRA efforts, we should be confident that they're empowering our teams to apply what's learned and remediate and improve our security program, and by extension, inspire our leadership and other departments in our organization who aren't so familiar with security and privacy tenets, so that they understand their own place and their own responsibility and how they can improve our security program. Ultimately, we want to know the ins and outs of our security program, both present and future state. With that, I'd like to say thanks everybody for listening, and I'll pass it off to Siobhan to moderate some Q&A.
Okay, great. Thanks, Ian and Harrison. That was a great explanation. A couple of questions that we've gotten in. The first one is, does the entirety of our company need to be in scope for an SRA?
That's a good question. I will say that technically, in order to comply with HIPAA and OCR requirements, your SRA should certainly take into scope any component of your company or any service that specifically handles, processes, stores PHI. That is ultimately what needs to be in scope. Of course, you're also able to conduct focused security risk assessments or targeted security risk assessments as needed to parts of your program that may have been newly introduced, like new technologies, or if changes have been made to your environment or even changes to the regulatory environment are great targets for that targeted security risk assessment. So you don't always need to have your whole company in scope. One example might be the recent introduction of a telehealth application or remote access application that you might have implemented in the wake of COVID-19. And you could perform a security risk assessment with respect to some of the most recent publications coming from OCR about enforcement discretion, for example. Hopefully that answers your question.
Okay, that's great. We have another one. Could you expand a little bit more on how the final report of findings from your SRA service offering can be tailored around different regulations such as the NIST, CSF, or HITRUST?
Ian, I'll take that one. So I'll kind of split this up into two parts. So for NIST CSF, like similar to the SRA, we'll perform an in-depth analysis and scoring for all of the findings that we took from the SRA, and then we'll categorize them based on applicable NIST CSF functions and subcategories. So we make sure that we stay up to date with all of our regulations. So NIST CSF only recently came out with their version 1.1. So we'll utilize their set of functions and subcategories to categorize all of our findings. And then once again, like the SRA, we will provide our rationale for our assigned scoring, and then also provide remediation recommendations to improve those overall scores. And then similarly for HITRUST CSF, if your organization is really going through and trying to become HITRUST certified, we can tailor the SRA and our findings to the appropriate domain and requirements. Enterprise Health, we are HITRUST assessors, so we're very, very experienced with the HITRUST certification. So as we specified today, an SRA is really already a HITRUST requirement, but by going into the level of detail that we provide or that our process goes into, we can help your organization really identify areas of concern which may impact other administrative, physical, and technical HITRUST security requirements as well.
Okay, and we have one more here. So how deep does your SRA go into evaluating the controls of the tools and applications we use, like from Pixis or Microsoft?
That's a good question. So speaking directly to our SRA, and really any security risk assessment should definitely focus on how your company uses those applications to protect the privacy and security of PHI. In the context of a security risk assessment, that would be speaking to the policy and processes that dictate user behavior when accessing clinical applications and handling confidential data while they're in use, as well as any technical controls and policies that are applied at an organization level and directly affect how those applications are configured. For example, is your company using federated identity and single sign-on to centrally manage accounts and permissions across all the applications and services in your network? That would be the kind of information we would look at as it relates to the use of those types of applications in your environment. I think a deeper dive into how those applications function and really by extension what their parent company's approach is to security and privacy is considered a slightly different activity called third-party risk assessment. And I'll say that many of the tenets between SRA and third-party risk assessment are shared, but the process and the goals are just a little different. And we actually have some more reading and information on this topic available on our website if you wanted to dig a little deeper on that. But I think hopefully that answers your question. Thanks.
Thanks, both of you guys, and thank you everyone for joining us today. If you have any other questions for Ian or Harrison or about our security services in general, you can shoot me an email at scarroll, SCARROLL, @enterprisehealth.com, or visit our website. You can also follow us on LinkedIn, where we put all of our new webinars and articles. We post up there daily or weekly. So thanks you all for coming. Thanks Ian and Harrison again for all your work on this.